Mr. Delaney, you may proceed with your testimony. Thank you very much for coming to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and Chairman Schuster and the rest of my colleagues. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you today about a very important subject for the country, investing in our infrastructure and developing smart public-private partnership frameworks to do that. I have written testimony that I'd like to submit for the record. Thank you.
Yes, without objection, so ordered.
So, in my judgment, investing in our infrastructure should be our top domestic economic priority as a nation. And I say that for three reasons. First, investing in our infrastructure creates jobs, and it creates jobs that have a decent standard of living associated with them. Secondly, it's incredibly important for our competitiveness, particularly in a global and technology-enabled world where you need a competitive infrastructure to compete globally. And third, it's proven to be a good investment. The data suggests that for every dollar we spend on infrastructure, we get $1.92 of economic benefit. So in my opinion, by any measure, this should be our top domestic economic priority. And we face a very significant challenge as a nation as it relates to the quality of our infrastructure. But that challenge is also a very significant opportunity. The American Society for Civil Engineers estimates that we have about a $4 trillion hole or gap in our infrastructure investment. In other words, that's the amount of money we'd have to spend as a nation to bring our infrastructure up to world-class standards, which I think we all want to do if we want to compete in the world that we live in. But to fill that gap, in other words, to increase investment in infrastructure to that magnitude, you have to engage private capital against this challenge. Historically, infrastructure investment has been done by government, federal government, state government, local governments. But right now, at this moment in time, governments, most governments, are financially challenged. Yet at the same time, the private sector has more cash, almost $5 trillion of cash on its book, than it's ever had. So it seems to me very smart public policy involves engaging that private sector capital against this need, this challenge, this opportunity we have as a nation, this need and this challenge that has typically been filled by the public sector. And that's why the work you're doing around developing smart public-private partnership frameworks to meet this challenge is so important. And fortunately, there are bipartisan solutions to this challenge, one of which is something called the Partnership to Build America Act, which is a piece of legislation I introduced in the House about 10 months ago. Right now, the Partnership to Build America Act has 30 House Republicans and 30 House Democrats as co-sponsors of the legislation. In addition, about 2 months ago, it was introduced in the Senate, and there's a dozen senators, also bipartisan, that have co-sponsored the bill in the Senate. So as it stands today, the Partnership to Build America Act is the most significant piece of bipartisan legislation in the Congress dealing with infrastructure, and in my opinion, by definition, it is also the most significant piece of bipartisan economic legislation in the whole of the Congress. What the Partnership to Build America Act does is create a financing entity called the American Infrastructure Fund, which is designed to be a permanent financing enterprise that can provide loans and bond guarantees to states and local governments. And it's particularly focused just on states and local governments. It cannot be used by the federal government. It can finance all forms of infrastructure, all the food groups, if you will, transportation, energy, communications, water, and it'll exist for 50 years. It's capitalized up front with $50 billion of permanent capital that is put in the entity at its inception. So it's never subject to annual appropriations from Congress, and that capital will stay in the entity for 50 years. That capital can be levered 15 to 1. So in other words, it'll create a $750 billion revolving infrastructure bank bond guarantor to finance states and local governments for 50 years. We think that money can turn 2 to 3 times. In other words, it'll provide $2 trillion of infrastructure financing and create over 3 million jobs. But in addition to being large-scale and unique in terms of its financing capability, it's also unique in terms of how it's capitalized. The $50 billion is not put in by the federal government, but is put in by companies. And the way they do that is they buy 50-year, 1% non-government guaranteed bonds. And as an incentive to get the companies to buy these bonds, we say that for every dollar of these bonds a company buys, they can repatriate a certain amount of their overseas cash back to the United States tax-free. So what we're doing is we're tying into the huge amount of U.S. corporate cash that's sitting overseas. Almost half of U.S. corporate cash sits overseas. And we should be creating pathways for that money to come back as part of tax reform. But in the meantime, we're tapping into that money to capitalize this bank. So this strategy will create a $750 billion revolving infrastructure fund for 50 years without any taxpayer spending to capitalize it at the inception. And one of the reasons it's been so bipartisan, because it fuses together two concepts that each party has talked about for a long time. Democrats have talked about increasing our investment in infrastructure for 20 years, and we've been right about that. And my Republican colleagues have talked about creating paths for the overseas cash to come back to the United States so it can be invested in our economy, and they've been right about that. The Partnership to Build America fuses those ideas together to launch the American Infrastructure Fund.